Well, it's the middle of March, the beginning of the second season of the Camp Chaos Chronicles, and it's time that we got off our duffs and got to work. And the first major project that we're going to do has to do with the XJ40 Champ Car. Sweet. Dang it. Now the next stage in our XJ6 Champ Car preparation has to do with these things right here. Now these are the wheels and tires that we've selected. It's got the offset we need to get as close as we can to clearing both the inside and the outside of the fender well. Also, the wheel is a relatively readily available offset and style that in the event that we break a wheel, we can get that exact wheel, because we don't want to redo everything that we're getting ready to do in order to make this wheel and tire combination work. This is a 275 4017 tire, and I forget exactly what the offset is on the wheel, but it's got a lot of offset to the inside. So the problem here being right up there. The problem is that we are almost making contact right there. Now, instead of having springs and shocks in here, we've got a piece of threaded rod with a couple of nuts on each end that is holding the wheel and tire in the neutral position that it's going to be in. We're going to have to find shocks and springs later in order to actually make that happen. But right now, this is what we got. So what are we going to do? Well, if it was just about this lip right here, what we could do is take the 4.5-inch death wheel, cut along here, and put a piece of 5/16 rod on the inside, weld it in place, and that would probably almost give us what we need. However, beyond it, up here, this curves in. Again, this would probably not be a big deal, except there's an inner fender well here that is about 1/4 of an inch further in. And that's sort of the deal breaker. We're gonna have to get rid of that somehow. Now, another thing to remember is that this wheel is on here without the brake hat or the brake rotor in between the wheel and the hub flange, which means that this is gonna stick out another 3/8 of an inch or so. So that's a big problem. Now, the initial solution to this would have been, or was, that we're going to cut the inner fender well out to the pinch weld where it joins the outer from the inner half of that fender well, cut that, separate it at this edge right here, and take that, which is generally in the shape of the flare that we want, and we could actually weld that into the outside, remove this material here, and then weld it on the outside. Plenty of room. A couple of problems with that. First of all, it would be unspeakably ugly compared to what it is right now. Another problem is that we need to, in order for this to have the structural integrity that it had before we started cutting everything out of here, we would have to be able to attach that blister to what's left of the inner fender well. And okay, that's not a problem. Just take some steel and fill the gap. Well, the regulations of Champ Car says that if you add additional material to the car, you're going to suffer a point penalty. And what they do is they take the number of point penalties that you've got, and that converts into penalty laps. And that means that you start the race 2 or 3 laps behind. You don't want to do that. Even in a 6-8 hour race, you don't want to do that. So we got to come up with another solution. And here's what we did. Well, here we go. Right side of the car is done. And you may well ask, you know, what did you do? Because it looks a whole lot like the before picture. We got 2 inches of clearance now between the fender well and the tire when the deflection of the suspension goes up to 3 inches and beyond. And we haven't actually changed the contour of the external panels of the vehicle. Not in a way that's obvious. So the question is, how in the world do you do that? Well, let me explain. The first thing we did was to take the 4.5-inch grinder cutoff wheel and cut the lip of the fender well all the way around. And that would be to the outside of where the spot welds, the pinch welds that secure the inner fender well to the outer fender together. And what that did then is separated the two along this line right here. We then took the same tool, and there is a weld right here that secures the inner fender well from the outer inner fender well. And you cut along that line all the way from front to back. At that point up here, there were a few spot welds to separate the inner fender well from the rest of the structure of the vehicle. And we made a cut at the front here between the lip that was originally secured to the fender and that cut along the pinch weld. We cut that there, and also at the back, and that then separated the inner fender well, and it came out. Now at that point, it was still my plan to use that inner fender well as a blister to put on the outside to give us our clearance. But when the full scale of the ugly of how that was going to look set in, we came up with this plan. And to make this plan work, what we're going to have to do is one more cut. And that cut runs from the rear of the wheel well all the way to the rear of the car. And what this does is allows this whole quarter panel to be moved around. Now the fun part begins. So what is this magic process that I use to create 1.5 inches of additional tire to fender clearance without actually making it visible from the outside of the car to any great extent? Well, it involved a bit of brute force. I started out using a jack that I already had. And this one is a 20-ton jack that probably weighs 35, 40 pounds. And that was what you would probably term unwieldy. I then went out and just went hog wild at Northern Tool and bought this 4-ton bottle jack, which works perfectly. So this is what we're going to use to jack that quarter panel out. Now obviously, if we just went ahead and stuck this in between the inner fender well and the quarter panel and started jacking, we would generate a pretty good dimple up here at this end. So what I did is I created a tool out of 6061 aluminum. It's got a pocket machined in it, that nest right here that keeps it from falling while you're trying to position it for the next push. And then I took some of this blue builder's foam and I strapped it on the top of that piece of aluminum with Gorilla Tape. Now by the time I got done with the right side, that's what that block of foam looked like. But as you can see, it conformed to the shape of the lip of the quarter panel. And so a couple of things. First of all, it spread the load out perfectly when I was applying pressure with the jack. And secondly, it kind of nested up against the lip of the quarter panel to help position things when I moved it to a new location. So it worked real well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take some Gorilla Tape, which if you don't ever roll this around the shop, you really ought to have one. And I'm going to set this stuff up so we can get started. Well, first of all, before we start doing anything, let's take a look at what we're trying to accomplish here. Now, what you see here is a set of measurements that I took from the other side. And one of the most difficult things to do when you're modifying body work on a car is to make sure that one side is the same as the other side. And so what I've done is a foot up from the rocker panel, I took a measurement on the other side, and then every 6 inches after that, I did the same thing. And we can see that right here, as it exists right now, the distance between the inner fender well and here is 12 3/4 inches. On the other side, on the finished quarter panel, it's 13 1/4, so we need to pick up a 1/2 inch. At this point, it's 13 inches, and we need 13 3/4. So this needs to come out 3/4 of an inch. Here, 12 3/4, we need to go out to 14, quite a bit more, 1 1/4 inches. And then down here, we've got to come out 1.5 inches. Okay, now you'll notice that as you go back, it gets greater. And the reason for that is the rear quarters converge as they come to the back. So, this lip right here is also converging. So what this will do, if I observe these measurements right here, this edge will be pretty much, at least to this point, run pretty much parallel to the center line of the vehicle. So there you go. Now this side should be a bit easier to do than the other side, because the other side was kind of trial and error. It's really kind of a simple process, and I look for this side to go easier. Twelve 3/4 or 14, and we are there already. Give it a little more of a push. Now at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to jack this out to the final dimension that I recorded out here on the fender. And if you remember that curve that you can see back here, that was just a saw curve to begin with, now it's about 1 inch wide. What we're going to do is we are going to, once we get this gap or this fender in position, we're going to weld a piece of material across this gap in order to hold that in place. What that piece of steel will allow us to do at this point is pull the jack out, and the dimension at the rear of the flare should be about where we want it to be. Then we can start adding some other stuff. Well, it did come in about 3/4 of an inch, but we can deal with that later. We've got enough clearance here now where we can start working our way around again and gradually get it opened up to the point where we just have to do some fine tuning. We've gone around this wheel well probably 3 times at this point with the jack, moving it a little bit further out every time, and we are about 1/4 inch of where we want to be. And you can see that if you compare this to the earlier view of the right-hand fender well, you can see that the curve is just about the same. And you can see that we've opened this up about 1 3/4 of an inch here. That wedge-shaped hole, of course, is going to be covered with or plugged up with a piece of metal welded in place. So, yeah, we're right on schedule. The next thing we have to do is prepare this inner fender well that we removed, that we were originally using as a blister to gain us the clearance that we need. This needs to be reinstalled. And the first thing we need to do is we need to cut off this outer edge right here because we no longer need that. The other thing we need to do is we need to, being that we moved the quarter panel out 1.5 inches, we need to build this up at least 1.5 inches, probably more like 2 inches, by adding a strip of material all the way from this end to that end. Now, remember I said that if you add material to the vehicle that didn't originally come with it, they charge you a penalty or a number of penalty points. Well, where are we going to get that material? Well, right over there. We got a trunk lid that has to go on a diet. So we've cut that material out of the trunk, and you can see it right here. And you can see we've already cut big chunks out of it. We did that already for the other side of the car. What you do basically is you cut out what you need, take a hammer, flatten it, and weld it on. Now, the question is, what are you going to do with a piece like this? Because you flatten that out and it's just going to be all over the place. The thing about parts like this is that they take a flat piece of metal, put it between two dies, one that has the shape of the inside of the part, one that has the shape of the outside, and then they bang on it. And what that does basically is stretches everything into the shape that they want. Well, if we are going to use this, we got to have it flat. So that's going to take some work. This is as flat a piece of material as we need for the purpose that we intend to use it for. Just to give you some idea of what you can do here, this used to be the mirror image of this. There's off, both of them off of the trunk lid. And you can see that I'm going to be able to get the two 20+ inch strips out of it that I need in order to extend that inner fender well. And we've got that left over and that up there left over for something else. Time to cut me some metal. We've got the outer inner fender well extension in place and trimmed for the most part to... Now the final fabrication step is to reinforce this edge all the way around. And so what you do is you go to the hardware store and you pick up a piece of 5/16 mild steel rod. Don't get galvanized, because when you weld everything together, we've got one piece that we need to do yet, that piece right there. We're gonna wait until we're done getting the other two flanges in place so that we got plenty of flexibility to make sure that we can make contact everywhere, and then we'll weld that up in place and also weld up those holes. Only one more bit of fabrication to do, and that's kind of a fun one. So, yeah, coming right along. Galvanized metal, it gives off harmful vapors, and none of us need that. So, the first thing I'm going to do, you'll notice that down at the bottom here, and up at the front, right here, there's a bit of a curve. And so, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to the vise, and as I've already started, put a little bit of a kink on the end there so that I can get it to conform to this curvature here. Now the rest of this, from here up round to here, this is all pretty much flat and parallel to the center line of the vehicle. So we don't have to do a lot of compound bending here. But here at this end and up at the front, we got a little bit of a kink that we need to impart to the end of this. And there we go. The rod is in. There's a little bit of tweaking that we need to do yet, but not much. And it's a nice tight fit all the way around. That took about a half hour to do. So we're ready to stick this side together. Well, there we've got the inner fender welded in place all the way around, and our welding mojo for light sheet metal didn't show up until real late in the day, so this is kind of a struggle. The rear fender flares are done. That's kind of a difficult job out of the way. We really didn't understand how we were going to make that work, and it really turned out very clean, relatively easy. It just took a long time to do. My only concern is that door going to fit? We modified the quarter panel, we can modify a door. So now we can move on to other things like front fender flares, for example. But that's a story for another day. So if you like these videos and you want to see more of the Champ Car, like us, subscribe, follow us on social media, leave some comments down below to help us do what we do better, and we'll see you the next time on the Camp Chaos Chronicles.